The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Beto O'Rourke campaign, which is sort of breathing its last gasps, I would say, not doing particularly well, they admitted that they kicked out a Breitbart news reporter from a campaign event in South Carolina. They also went after Breitbart as walking a line between being news and a perpetrator of hate speech. Beto O'Rourke's national press secretary said Beto for America believes in the right to a free press and works hard to ensure the campaign reflects that. However, whether it's dedicating an entire section of their website to black crime, inferring that immigrants are terrorists, or using derogatory terms to refer to LGBTQ people, Breitbart News walks the line between being news and a perpetrator of hate speech. Given this particular Breitbart employee's previous hateful reporting and the sensitivity of the topics being discussed with students at a historically black college, a staffer made the call to ask to leave the Breitbart reporter. This Breitbart reporter's name is Joel Pollack, who was ejected from a historically black college event in South Carolina that Beto O'Rourke was doing. So, right away, Pat, you hear the people on the right saying this is censorship. This is not for a free press. You criticize Trump for being against the media, and you're doing the same thing. Listen, it's not. Of course, if you want to make a qualitative distinction between Breitbart and Trump going after the Washington Post, I think you can do that, and you would be right to make that distinction. However, on principle, this is starting to wade into sort of potentially dangerous territory for Beto O'Rourke, not because Breitbart is a reasonable news outlet, but because it is actually hard to defend this in a way that doesn't make you seem as though you were doing exactly what you criticize the right of doing.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this. And whenever situations like this arise, I like to think about it as if, like, what if the shoe was on the other foot? Like, what if Trump kicked out a reporter from a left-wing publication, an actual left-wing publication, not like the mainstream news organizations he calls left-wing, but something like, like the Daily Kos or Mother Jones, those are typically thought of as left-wing organizations, right? So if he kicked out a reporter from one of those organizations, what would the response be? Like, I would not be very pleased with that. But at the same time, is that the most fair comparison? Because it's not as if those organizations are perpetrating hate speech. Those aren't inherently racist or sexist institutions like you can call Breitbart as being. So I don't know if that's necessarily like the best analogy necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know that it is. And at the same time, I mean, listen, the Trump administration, okay, we can say CNN is not actually a left-wing outlet. And so when Trump kicked them out for being against him, he was wrong about their political bias. But it doesn't really matter because it's still an action that he took under the perception or under his belief. And we were completely against it. I mean, we were 100% against it. I do think that there is a difference, though, and I hate to start equivocating. There is a difference between the White House revoking the press pass of someone who is properly credentialed and a campaign simply saying we don't want a particular reporter at a particular campaign event. Other people, AOC has been criticized for sometimes doing events that are closed to press. If you're not the president and you're not revoking a press pass, you do have leeway in terms of who you allow in. So I think maybe your question about how would we react if the shoe was on the other foot is a good one. I just think that it's not really equivalent to compare this to Trump and the White House press corps because we're talking about candidates here doing events at colleges, not the White House press room as an example.
Yeah, and maybe it would have been better ultimately if Beto O'Rourke and his campaign team just allowed the Breitbart reporter into the room because then it wouldn't have blown up into what it's become. Breitbart has responded by saying that the accusation that Breitbart is racist is absolutely not true, and that the reporter was an Orthodox Jew married to a black woman who serves in the military. That's what Breitbart likes to do, right? They like to hire these people who are part of minority groups as a way to sort of give themselves legitimacy and give themselves a platform and good standing to go after the minority groups that they claim to be representative of. They did it with Ben Shapiro. They've done it with a number of other reporters in the past as well.
Yep, no question about it. And we will see whether this becomes more of a trend. Again, do you disagree that Beto is on his way out and that it's going to be more a question of what policies the candidates that last longer are going to enact with regard to right-wing media covering events?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely not going to be Beto as the 2020 Democratic nominee. I think at this stage in the race, we're probably down to 4. I think it's Biden, Bernie, Warren, or Kamala. I don't see anyone else really having a shot. Maybe you could throw Buttigieg in there, but I don't really see it.
I tend to agree with you, and we are already down to one debate night in September as a result of 5 candidates bailing and 3 more not making the debate. So the numbers are definitely starting to dwindle. There is a problem in Japan on public transport of groping, and typically it is men groping women. And there is a new invisible ink anti-groping stamp that has been beta tested. There was a limited run made of 500 stamps retailing for about $24. It's sold within 30 minutes, made by the company Shachihara, I think is pronounced. I'm not really sure, but that's a very rough approximation. And the idea here is that you can mark an assailant with this invisible ink. And there were ideas floated about maybe you could have like a safety pin and you could stab the person. But the idea here is to better be able to identify who it is that's doing this. The only thing I don't really, I think it's an interesting idea, Pat. The only thing I don't understand is police have said they're not at all involved. At what point, like, who is the stamp visible to? When does it become visible? And like, what are the actual logistics of how it's supposed to work?
Yeah, and of course, I mean, poking people with a safety pin, that would be a bad idea, and that could actually be counterproductive because
Yes.
then you're assaulting the assailant, and that maybe thought of as self-defense, but it may not be as well, and that would raise some issues. If you're stamping people against their will, could that also be considered assault? I don't, of course, know the specific laws in Japan, but
You don't?
I would
That's
imagine
shocking.
that maybe it could be. And yeah, also there's the question about how effective this is going to be because the average person isn't going around with ultraviolet lights looking around for this sort of thing. And how long does this even last for anyway? Like, does it wash off? Like, I don't know. There's so many fronts to this which make me give a little bit of pause and make me wonder if it's even such a good idea.
Yeah, I don't know a lot of the logistics of it, but what I do know is that there are lots of countries that have taken action to try to deal with this issue of groping on crowded subway trains. And, it's in New York City, every once in a while, I would have a really crowded subway train when I would take the subway to the office. In Boston, I'm taking the subway more at times where it is less crowded. But in places like Japan, India is another one. There are real issues with persistent groping on public transit because in part of how crowded the trains are. One thing a particular region of India did is they set up women-only cars on trains, and that has been extremely effective. And of course, there are people on the right who like to ridicule it by saying, well, what if a man just says that they are a woman? It's not been a problem, shockingly, even though it's been going on for years. That's been really effective. But the bigger picture of groping on public transit is a pretty big issue that a lot of countries are trying to deal with.
Yeah, that woman's only car thing on trains. I think that's an interesting idea. Of course, you can't solve every potential crime that way. There also could be women who are perpetrators of sexual assault against other women on those trains. So not necessarily a perfect solution, but I think that's a little bit more of a step in the right direction as compared to the stamp idea. I don't think this will. I mean, apparently they sold out and maybe it will catch on, but I just don't see how and how it's going to be effective.
There are 2 individuals in Montana, Ryan Patrick Morris and Troy Allen Nelson, who recently violated the terms of their respective probations, unrelated cases last week. And Montana's district judge, Greg Pinsky, put in place a pretty unique list of punishments to their sentences, including ordering them to wear signs saying that they are liars for pretending that they had served in the military. The judge sentenced Morris to 10 years in prison for felony burglary and 3 more years suspended. Nelson got 5 years for felony criminal possession of drugs with 2 years suspended. But before either of them can be eligible for parole, the judges decided that they need to demonstrate remorse for having lied about military service in order to receive more lenient sentences by, number 1, writing letters of apology to AMVETS, the American Legion, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. They need to handwrite the names of all 6,756 Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. They need to write obituaries of the 40 Montanans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. They need to complete 441 hours of community service, 1 for each of the Montanans killed in combat since the Korean War. And they are going to need to visit the Montana Veterans Memorial for 8 hours on both Memorial Day and Veterans Day, wearing placards that say, I am a liar, I am not a veteran. I stole valor. I have dishonored all veterans. What do you think about this punishment, Pat?
I'm not a big fan of it. Like, certainly these people did something that was wrong, right? They, stole valor, if not in an officially charged way. They did so, and they should be punished for that. But I think that punishment should come by way of the typical outlets for doing that, right? Like, maybe they have to go to jail, they have to go to prison, maybe they have to pay a fine. But the idea that we're going to like publicly shame them in this sort of way, make them hold signs up, I don't know. It reminds me of something that's a little bit too draconian, like the stocks in more ancient times, like that people can just like come across these people and publicly ridicule them. I'm not a big fan of it. These people did something wrong, but I don't think that this is the right way of going about dealing with it.
Yeah, it's not cruel and unusual punishment. So I'm against the death penalty for like a dozen different reasons, one of which I find that it's cruel and unusual punishment. But I do think that putting to death citizens, residents, people is unbecoming of a government. A government should not be involved in that. In the same way, I tend to think a government should not be involved in shame and embarrassment as a function of punishment. I know that you could make the case that what we do to a lot of people in the justice system is actually even worse. Instead of maybe some shame and then letting them go back into society is better than some of the inhumane conditions in which we hold people in prisons, for example. And I wouldn't disagree with you about that. But when you zoom out, I have a hard time getting behind shame and embarrassment being sort of like a tool of the justice system that's used. It feels, again, unbecoming of what a justice system should be.
Yeah, and it's not terribly unique, too. In 2012, a Cleveland woman was ordered to stand on a street corner holding a sign that said, "Only an idiot would drive on the sidewalk to avoid a school bus." Now, obviously, it sounds like that woman did a terrible thing,
yes,
and a very stupid thing, but I don't think she should have to do that. Also in Ohio, a judge made a man hold a sign outside of a police station that said, "I apologize to police officers for being an idiot and calling 911 threatening to kill you. I'm sorry, and that will never happen again." I think we should do away with this sort of stuff. I know people get very riled up when you talk about stolen valor and military-related things, but this is just way too far, I think. Go with the usual ways of punishing people, not with something like this. It feels like it's creative and clever, but it's ultimately just way too far.
It's funny to me sometimes when you will hear from right-wingers, what is the worst thing someone can do? And it's very popular for them to say, the worst thing anyone can do is accuse someone else of racism. And it's like, really? I can think of much worse things, but that's like a popular line. You can't do anything worse than accuse someone of racism. You often will also hear, you can't do anything worse than having claimed to be a member of the military when you weren't. Stolen valor is the worst thing that you can do. In reality, there are so many different things that humans can do. I try to stay away from this terminology of what is the worst, but stolen valor does seem like a really not nice thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't shy away necessarily with like ranking what crimes are the worst and which ones aren't so bad.
Like stealing a candy bar.
That's exactly right. I would put murder at the top of the list, and child molestation's up there, and rape is up there. But stolen valor, I wouldn't rank in the top 10 even. Maybe it's very bad. You shouldn't do it, and there should be penalties for it. But I don't think it's as severe as many people make it out to be.
Is it possible, though, that our perspective on this is skewed because we are not veterans, and that if we were veterans and we had experienced things that someone else could just roll up and say, I also did, when they didn't, maybe we would feel differently?
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, that would certainly give us perspective on the idea, but it becomes a little bit of an identity politics argument that, only people in the military can talk about how severe or how bad stolen valor is as a crime. I think people who are just average civilians who haven't served in the military can weigh in on that too.
Yeah, in the same way that if you know someone who was the victim of a murder, or someone who was a murderer, or you don't, everybody can comment about murder, and maybe you're making sort of the same point when it comes to stolen valor. Let me know what you think in the audience in terms of whether you like these embarrassment, shame, public shame type punishments, or you think that the justice system should stay away from it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.